For the public good and formerly served as director for the National Center for Institutional Diversity. Recently, of this year, August, John was featured in a massive open online course sponsored by a partnership with Coursera titled Leading for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. In higher education, it draws current and aspiring leaders into a discussion about how these three important values differ. It may even be in tension with one another and explore why they seem to be difficult to actualize within higher education society. John, without further ado, I know you ran in, man.
Michael, thank you very much. And the warmth is returned. I really hope to leave some time to hear from you today. I did prepare some opening thoughts, but I think a discussion may lead us to the best conclusions, so prepare yourselves. There are some individuals and some groups that have been on top so long that they've forgotten how they got there. There are nations that have enjoyed extended periods of prosperity and influence. They've judged themselves to be exceptional, perhaps even blessed. In fact, they have been blessed. We've been blessed by timing, geographic accident, abundant natural resources, and by countless acts of service, occasionally heroic, sometimes forced or systemic. Even while acknowledging our historical imperfections, nations like ours feel the right and perhaps even a destiny towards greatness. They have such faith in the durability and sophistication of their social institutions. They believe that any external threat can be met with strength, that any internal divisions are something that we can regard as mere sport, or maybe even a sign of ingratitude, but not as the start of a discussion and not as serious fissures. And contrary to every previous lesson of history, these nations live as if their own way of governance and their particular way of life has been given a guarantee of permanence. There are values that are so sacred, so honored in time, and confirmed in sacrifice that they could not possibly be lost, could they, between a few generations. You might say that these values are bound into our concept of a national character. These are the things we shout out at times of celebration, and we whisper in reliant prayer at times of crisis, when individuals going to church on a Sunday don't return. Perhaps we think that's enough to keep these values safe. And perhaps it is enough, because we can't walk away from values like these. They seem to be so central to who we are that we will not be abandoned by them, nor will we allow ourselves to alienate from them. In fact, I read somewhere that they had been written down to be inalienable. Our individual and collective prosperity, our national security, however you want to think about it, and our values are intrinsically linked. At one level, they're held together by traditions, symbols, myths, and shared beliefs, and that's what we call culture. At a structural level, however, the essential interdependency on which nations rise and fall is carried in our social institutions, the ones that we create and defend. And the most important investment we make collectively is in the durability and the continuing evolution and defense of these social institutions. If we're to be a democratic society, our social institutions must express, enact, and embody democracy and freedom. If we want to be otherwise, then our social institutions can and they will be otherwise. When we speak to each other in this way, in somewhat elevated rhetoric, calling forth high ideals, it can seem pretentious. No one, it seems, anymore, no leader in these contemporary times, draw frequently enough on these themes, in my opinion. And to espouse collective aspirations in a society that's so divided has become elitist. It's been described as elitist, but I don't think it's elitist. I think it's the opposite. I think it's democratic. I'm even suspicious that there's a reason that some people would prefer that we ignore, dismiss, or even ridicule an authentic, rational, passionate debate about where we are today and what we want to be better. To remind us of what is swirling about us and to compare it to what we hope for, after all, can detract from a suffocating message of fear that has so easily divided and degraded us. Now, standing here, I'm well aware that I've enjoyed the privilege in all the current structures and cultures that I've described. I work in a profession, as many of you do, that allows me to think, to write, and to speak freely. I work at a university that is among the most celebrated and, to be honest, among the most comfortable in the world. I'm a white man, a straight man, well-educated and Catholic in a society that for all of my lifetime has been white, straight, stratified, and Christian. You have every reason to ask yourself, should this be my place? But despite the advantages and the limitations of privilege, or maybe because of them, I know that I need to use every opportunity, and I hope you will as well, to be disruptive. I know why you're here today. I think I do. I know this conference, 18 years. I know the program. I also know that we're not all the same. In many ways, we're quite different, but we do have some essential things in common. Chief among them is our concern for students, for communities, for access to education, and for whatever it is that caused you to profess yourselves to this work. So I'd like you to be accepting of me for this moment and know that I'm speaking to you as one educator to others, but also as one son, one father, one grandfather, one neighbor, and one citizen. William Butler Yeats wrote his poem, The Second Coming, which is the poem that I displayed a minute ago, just about 100 years ago. He probably wrote it 100 years ago. It was published in 1919. It was at the end of what was called the Gilded Age. Are you familiar with that term? It came from a novel by Mark Twain. Never before had there been such a division among people economically, and never before had the whole world gone to war, essentially because it could, or because it thought it had to. It was inevitable. And before the spinning stopped or paused, the world would experience the conclusion of what was then called a Great War. Now there's an oxymoron. The Great War. The fall of powerful empires, economic devastation, tyranny, genocide, starvation and enslavement of millions, and most importantly for my comments today, widespread doubts about the practical limits of democracy. For a short period, most of us in this room have been given a respite. from that fearful uncertainty. We've lived our lives, for the most part, protected from some of that, although this nation has been at war for 16 years. And it's hard to know whether it's a real respite when we still live with the threat of sudden annihilation if some rocket doesn't quite make the arc that's intended for it, or annihilation of another sort from the gradual degradation of our environment. But this period of the last 100 years is one that people will look back on, perhaps many, many hundreds of years later, and call the Great American Century. It's also been described as the Great Century for American higher education, because it was during this time that most of our higher ed infrastructure developed, and it was also during this time where our country made at least a temporary commitment to educating all of our citizens. That's the work you do. Joseph Statler, in a report written for UBS, is anybody familiar with what UBS does? You almost can tell by looking at the logo in the building, right? UBS is a major investment company, and I have to acknowledge right now my wife and I have a few dollars placed there. Not enough to really get their attention, to tell you the truth, but it's there. They recently wrote a report that was directed to the billionaires of the world. And I'm not certain whether or not I'm going to be able to pull up that there's a link here to it. But you know what? We'll skip that. It's a 3-minute video in which they say to billionaires, time has never been better. This is a period of enormous growth. Money is spreading to billionaires in Asia, Middle East, and Russia. And most importantly, you have opportunities to network one with another, to actually grow your wealth even further. The Guardian reports that this is a new Gilded Age, and in fact, there's a lot of evidence for that. Even at the time when the huge divisions occurred in American society at the turn of the 20th century, we have never seen the divisions that we have now. The gap is wider than ever, and it's not just over the whole course of the 20th century. Some people think capitalism necessarily leads you to this, and there's some evidence that it does. But the gap actually started widening in the 1980s after coming together through most of the period following the Depression and the programs that followed. But from 2007 to 2016, the gap exploded between the wealthiest and others. And if you look closely at this slide, it gives you a very quick insight as to why American politics have taken the direction that they have. For low-income households, racial related wealth has stayed almost constant for African Americans and Latinos, much lower than whites. That should be corrected, but look what's happened to white wealth. And ask yourself, where is this fear and division stimulated? John Venn invented the Venn diagram in 1882 and set all of social science into a pattern of dividing one thing from another with circles. But never has there been a time when we have been more organized in terms of us and those who aren't us. Growth is good, right? Billionaires prospering, that must be good. People tell us that they'll invest in the rest of us. 8 people control more wealth than 50% of the people in the world. Our great colleague here, Carl Weick, those of you from Michigan may have heard Carl Weick, He's the founder of Sense Making. In a 1993 article, he wrote a very influential article about the Man Gulch disaster. It was a story of how firemen who were caught in a blaze that got out of control had to make sense of information that was ambiguous and coming at them, well, like a wildfire. And he observed that people put things together in their own ways so that they can act on them. And it's a critical role of leaders, especially during times of crisis. And for this morning's discussion, I'd like to invite you into kind of a simplified version of Carl Weick's sense-making, because I'd like to share just 4 short stories with you and have you think about how those stories relate one to another. I'm not going to give them titles. I'm going to let you give them titles. I think it's important to share stories because as someone who teaches leadership, which is what I do, I understand that a good part of leadership is communicating through stories. So I'm not here to speak in platitudes or exhortations. I've completed all those in my opening remarks. I just want to share a few stories. And I want to do it with reverence to, every time I get up to speak, I call my father to my right side and my son to my left. We all share the same name, John Burkhardt. And my father's father was John Burkhardt. And back and back and back. And there's a cemetery over here where they're buried. My grandson is the 7th first son of first sons. So when I talk, I think I'm just trying to relate a conversation that might have taken place between my father and my son. That's what we do. They were bookbinders, my father and my grandfather. And I never learned the craft of bookbinding. But I do kind of know how it starts. It starts with collecting, organizing, and presenting stories. So as you listen to these stories from the descendant of a bookbinder, some of them going back a full century, and by the way, no, I wasn't there. I look ancient, but I'm not. I want you to make a note on your iPad or your paper or something about what each story says to you as you hear it. Then we'll talk about it. In 1995, I was invited to a meeting at the White House. We met in the Roosevelt Room. If any of you ever see any West Wing or any of that other stuff, they always end up in the Roosevelt Room. My wife turns her head and puts her head down because I always say, I was there. And I was. Mrs. Hillary Clinton chaired the meeting. And it was a week after the Monica Lewinsky stuff came out. And I saw a woman compartmentalizing, I guess is what you'd have to say, with such enormous facility. The meeting was with a number of philanthropists. I was working with the Kellogg Foundation at that time. And we were discussing what could be done to restore the non-governmental organizations, what we call nonprofit organizations, in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern and Central Europe, especially higher education. There was a strong belief within the room that there had been a period starting in about the time that Yeats wrote his poem. We celebrate the assassination of Nicholas II and his family this year, 2018. A period in which it was believed that higher education had been constrained politically and economically in the Soviet Union. And we were there to try and figure out what we might be able to do about it. The Cold War had ended, but what had been frozen, and Disney had not given us Elsa yet, what had been frozen seemed more enduring than the polar ice cap, because cold, once it enters your bones, is very slow to leave. It was in a meeting in the context of the initiative that followed that I found myself at Salzburg, Austria, where many of these meetings took place. It was kind of a meeting place during the Cold War. And a rector from a Russian university stood to introduce himself. Now, rectors in that part of the world are the academic officers for these institutions. There's also a political officer, a party officer. They're kind of on a par. But the rector represents the faculty and the academic work. The rector stood, and we all have earphones on, right? Because we don't all speak the same languages. And he said, I represent a great university that has adhered to the highest academic values for 650 years, with a short interruption brought on by unfortunate economic and political constraints lasting about 72 years, ending only most recently. 72 years, a short interruption. A few of you smile or laugh. I did, right? And I waited for the rector's remarks to circulate across the room in translation. Although these were intelligent people and most of them spoke Russian, so they didn't have to wait. And I looked around to see the ironic smiles or a reflection of the obvious humor. 650 years with a short interruption brought on by unfortunate economic and political constraints. But no one was laughing. Whatever people might tell you about Russian oligarchs, they're a lot of fun. Well, not if you live in Russia, I suppose, but they have a really caustic sense of humor, and I figured that's where he was going with this. But he wasn't making a joke. It was normalized reporting. He was talking of the normal that he had experienced and that all of the faculty he led, and many generations of students had experienced. What Westerners would call economic ideology. Here's what he was saying in effect. We had these values that defined our academic life. They were suppressed, constrained, and denied expression across several generations of faculty careers and countless student experiences, and yet we are still defined by them. The values remained. The structures in which they had been enacted were overtaken for a while. I'm not sure what you'd entitle this story. I'm not sure what it's occurred to you to write down as the title for this story. I do know that our system of higher education in the United States is described elsewhere around the world as vast, expansive, and diversified. And I also know that the Romanov Empire would have been described in the early years of the 20th century as vast, expansive, and diversified. But it's not a guarantee of anything. To be vast, to have millions, tens of millions of students wanting to come to our college campuses, to have a system that is diverse with HBCUs, women's colleges, community colleges, research universities. Vast, expansive, and diversity is not a guarantee. Oh, our industry is safe. We hold an incredible market position. Some of our institutions, of course, are better positioned than others. But what we offer is deemed more important than any alternative available to our target demographic group, right? I mean, you know this. You live this. We've positioned ourselves as the only game in town for winners. And surprisingly, when you consider the rising costs of going to college and the fact that more and more people have to take on debt for themselves and their family, people keep coming to college. How could we be threatened by a short-term interruption in political and economic circumstances? This is the second story. This is from a poll taken by Gallup and released, I think, only about a week ago. I always try and get something new so you all don't think that I'm just old man talking. I am an old man talking, but with new information. This is what alumni say about their experiences in higher education. It's from a report titled Great Jobs, Great Lives, the Relationship Between Student Debt, Experiences, and the Perceptions of College Worth. Now, Gallup is pretty protective of its data, and they actually don't want it shared, but the title is Great Jobs, Great Lives, the Relationship Between Student Debt, Experiences, and Perceptions of College Work. So I've now cited it twice, right? It strikes me as odd that Gallup collects all its data by listening to the public, but then it doesn't feel like the public has a right to the data after it collects it, but that's another speech. You see that not only is only about half of the people who attend our colleges think that it was worth it, whatever that means, but you also see that it differs dramatically by type of institution, right? And by the time you get down to our for-profit institutions, only 1 out of 4 think it was, quote, worth it. There's a lot of ways that you might interpret this data, but here's one way. I'll let you make up your own story. I think some of our alumni, when they hear the word worth it, go to an economic frame. You think that's possible? And they ask themselves whether the tuition and the time and the loans were worth it. They could be out there, like this poor guy, asking himself, what happened to the $1 million payoff? You know what I'm talking about, the $1 million payoff, right? Well, you should know what I'm talking about because we're the ones who started that stuff around. I said stuff, but I was just trying to be polite. You know that was based on data collected in the 1980s in which we compared the average of incomes earned by those who graduated from college with incomes earned by those who only graduated from high school, compared to averages, right? You all know the story of Bill Gates going into the bar. You know this story? So here's all these, let's think it's us, right? We won't do the bar because, too much drinking on campus anyhow. So if we were all sitting here and Bill Gates walked in and what would happen to the median income in our room? The median wealth? Not very much. How about the modal income? That is the most typical amount of income. Not very much. What would happen to the average income? Whoa! Right? Because you'd add his wealth and everybody in the room, and you divide by the number plus 1, because he's here, and it looks like the average income is just astronomical, and comparing averages gives you that problem. Very wealthy people who graduated from college and made a lot of money overwhelm, on average, those who didn't. But we keep using that, right? But the only people who get rich in that bar or in this room is the proprietor, and that's only if Mr. Gates is thirsty, right? It hasn't changed our circumstances one bit. When you continue to relate that story to prospective students, and I think you do so, we all do so, with good intentions, as a way of encouraging more students to attend college. First of all, I think this is a time when we should stand up for the truth and begin by doing it ourselves. Always speak the truth as if your life depended on it. But secondly, what does that set up in the curriculum? What does that set up in learners' expectations? Why does our business school put up a new building every time it needs to change a light bulb? And the School of Education was built in the 1930s. What's happened to knowledge? And how has the economy become the central concern for most Americans? Here's one implication of that $1 million payoff and what it produces in the minds of students and families. How many of you studied higher education at the graduate level, at least at one point or another? Few? Yeah, so you all heard that there's about 5,000 colleges and universities in the United States, roughly. Well, in addition to those 5,000, there are 3,000 for-profit institutions, all that have been created for the most part since about 1980 or 1990. In other words, 60% increase in the number of colleges at a time when the demographic would suggest that the number of students who graduating from high school, we'll leave immigrants out for a moment, is going to decline. But we have 60% more colleges. 25% of the alums who are going to those colleges don't think it's good, worthwhile. Disproportionately, where are African Americans and Latinos attending? Where are low-income and first-generation students attending? Where is the debt? Gail Collins reported in the New York Times just last week that these institutions have names like the College of Berkeley, Columbia College, and here's one I like, Trump University. Unless our students really understand why college is important, unless we tell them why college is really important, individuals who will prepare for their lives for about 25 years, maybe 30, but only be employed for about another 20 or 25 after that, and then have 20 years in retirement or so, I hope. Why are we making this all about jobs? It's because we have all bought into the economic scarcity, the fear of economic abandonment that has been sold to us in the richest, most prosperous country in the world. We are all running around scared to death for our economic futures. You're probably aware, I teach philanthropy this semester, that 20 institutions control 80% of the endowments held by colleges and universities in the United States. And these are not the 20 institutions that are serving new entry students. Blacks and Latinos disproportionately served in community colleges and in nonprofit businesses, I'll call them, without endowments. Not because their race disqualifies them, but because as an accident of where they were born and grew up and educated. That's the difference. And it's the difference between a first-class ticket from Los Angeles to Detroit is about $3,000. The seats in front of the curtain lean back, and the food is actually quite good. The remaining choices in higher education are in economy and basic economy, where the pretzels are free. Where would you like your children to sit on that plane? I want to tell you briefly a third story. This is about two men, W.E.B. Du Bois and Charles Johnson, who debated through most of the early years of the 20th century how to advance African Americans in our society. Mary Beth Gasman at Penn wrote a great article on this in 2002, which I'm going to mangle in the interest of time. Most of you know who Du Bois was, great philosopher. Fewer know who Charles Johnson was. He was son of parents who strongly supported an education. He was a physician. Johnson believed that our institutions serving African Americans, our HBCUs, as they were not yet called, our black colleges and universities, should focus on vocational education and prepare individuals for jobs in society. He believed that economic power was the only path to political power. His phrase was, put down your bucket where you are. Don't try and teach people things that won't help them. Now, Du Bois felt quite differently, probably aware that he graduated Harvard, first doctorate from Harvard University for an African American in the country. He also had a concept of what we call now the talented tenth, which he also described in Souls of Black Folks. And he believed advancement would come from educating at least a sizable percentage of individuals with understanding of the great themes, the great issues, the great ideas of history. Because he believed full freedom and emancipation would come through leadership, political leadership, and an awareness of how the system worked. I'm wondering how that worked out. Actually, both of them were vindicated by subsequent events. We do have a system where a talented percentage of individuals find their way to institutions where they get a great exposure to many ideas. But by and large, not only African Americans and Latinos, but poor whites end up in colleges with a vocational orientation, where they aren't taking courses in philosophy or history, where they're not learning about democracy. My last story, and I'll try and make it quick because I want to talk. This story spans about 2,500 years. It's a story of an idea that once people felt worth fighting for. My father did. In the field of political science, there's a theory to describe a process called democratic consolidation. And essentially, it suggests that as the world progresses and as countries turn towards democratic rule, they don't turn back. And that theory held up for most of the 20th century following World War II, until 2005. And now the number of autocratic nations and declining democracy has increased every year for the last decade. I keep thinking about our Russian colleague and his reference to unfortunate economic and political constraints and trying to figure out if this explains why democracy is less important to people. Economic scarcity will do that. Fear will do that. Cold, once it enters your bones, is slow to leave. This is a survey that has been conducted regularly for 5 or 6 decades and reported in the Journal of Democracy last spring. This is the percentage of people who say it's essential to live in a democracy. You'll see that people born in the 1930s felt about 75% of them that it was essential. Look what's happening across the world. Democracy is no longer considered essential by many people. And the last data here is people born in the 1980s. How many were born here in the 1980s? If I raise my hand, will you laugh? That's us. That's us as we stopped teaching people some of the things that any 19th century or 20th century person would have known. That's us as we shifted our attention to vocational education. That's us as we told people that the reason that they should go to college is because there's $1 million payoff. Now, there's a lot of debate as to what this data means. Some suggest that people have never experienced democracy in the United States. And consequently, they think they lived without it so long that maybe it's not essential. Whoops, I'll jump to. There's also data that just came out in June that is a little harder to interpret, but I'll try and get to it quickly. In 2 years, the percentage of Republican and right-leaning voters that felt that higher education was a net positive to our society went from nearly 60% to about 30%, which is to suggest 60-some% believe it's a net negative. Democrats and left-leaning, pretty much constant at 72%. The same individuals on both sides said, it was good for me. Higher education's good for me, it's just bad for society. They also pointed out that higher education does a pretty good job of preparing people for work. And that's what they should do. They should stick to that. Because ideology is not the role. They pointed to the fact the liberal professors, the constraints, the political correctness. Stay in your lane. Prepare people for work. In fact, one individual said, we really don't need further advancements in knowledge and science. We can't even manage the ones we have. What do these 4 stories mean? Tell me what you think they mean to you. I'm just the bookbinder. What would you call this first story, this one of the Russian thing? Did anybody write down a name for that? Cold, huh? How would you remember it? If somebody said, what was the first story? Do you have what would be your quick thing? Russian? Okay. How about the second story of the alum? What did you take from that? Does it have a name? Dissatisfaction? Anger? Fear? Mixed signals? Disappointment? Mixed signals given by higher ed and society, do this, Nothing is more disturbing than unmet expectations, right? How many people are married in the room? It's all about expectations, folks. It's not even about my expectations, it's about Janice's expectations, to be honest. But how about the Du Bois-Johnson argument? What brings us closer to lifting every voice? What name would you put on that? Great discussion, something to think about. Giants. Maybe I'd put what's happened. And democracy. What do you think about that for your children and grandchildren or your nieces and nephews or yourself? Democracy doesn't matter. If truth doesn't matter. If short-term political and economic constraints can lead us to a point where higher education is just an industry, 12 million customers. I'm really hoping that you'll talk now. If you don't want to talk to me or if you don't want to talk publicly, talk. Talk. That's what I'm doing. I've got this great role. And I pretty much decided as I'm approaching retirement, I'm not going quietly. I'll tell you why. My good friend introduced me as a professor. And I came to that role late in my life. I'd done a lot of other things first. And it caused me to think about, what am I willing to profess? You're all professionals. What are you professing? Are you professing that higher education is a good deal? Well, it is, and it can be, if you understand the deal. If you understand what it really is about. Are we putting more and more people through our colleges? I mean, that data about democracy, that was all during a period when more and more people were going to college. And yet a steady erosion in commitment to some of the shared values I was talking about at the outset of my speech when you all thought I was crazy. What do you profess? What are you willing to profess?
I think when you ask the question,
Loomis, you're going to have to just get up because we can't hear you.
okay. So when I think about the question, what do I profess? I think about what I tell students, and I tell them the same thing. Higher education is good, it's important, because it's a place where you can learn, and it's an environment where you learn with people from all over the world. I think it's one of the best places to learn. It's the expectation that you learn. It's the expectation that you think critically. But I also profess to them that in some ways it's part of an illusion and a facade. Because even in institutions of higher education, definitely in K-12, there are so many things that are not taught about the reality of the world that we live in. I believe in democracy, but I also believe that we struggle to live in a real democracy. And I think the first thing to profess to students when they're younger, and not once they have to, not when they're older, right? When they're younger, is to let them know the realities that we struggle to live fully as a democracy. It's evidence in our curriculum. When there are certain things left out, when children can't learn about their history and the ways in which we struggle. The notion that we don't prepare students to deal with struggle, to deal with the questions we have unanswered, and we make them believe as though we have all the answers as adults, that we really do live in a fully democratic society. When we know that it's not true. So my profession to them and to other people that I work with is that they deserve the truth, because the sooner they get it, the sooner they become solutionaries. So my profession is that, and I really appreciate what you offer. I think one of the things that I often tell people is that I really think the root of it is that there's this myth of scarcity. We allow this to go on because we think that if my children don't have the best opportunities and everybody has equal opportunity, somebody's going to lose out. That's a myth that we buy. And as long as we buy that myth, we're going to do what a human does, and we're going to make sure that we hoard as much as we can for our young. So we have to let go of the myth. So that's why I really appreciate it.
Well, Loomis, I'm not at all surprised, given your thoughtfulness, that you have worked that out. And towards the end, something that I think we probably all realize is that part of leadership, or part of what we do in our profession, is what we express to others, but it really begins with some self-examination, right, about where we are. And I want to acknowledge that the tools and the experiences I have to draw on are different than the ones that you draw on. And they can be distorting to me based on, hey, 7 generations of knowing who your father was? That's a privilege. That's different. So I have to acknowledge that privilege. I have to acknowledge that my experiences are not better, but I have to consult them. I have to think about them. You have to think about yours. Other thoughts? This isn't church, you know. You can talk back, yeah.
Ordinarily, I don't like to preface my statement, but I want to preface my statement. I'm not trying to paint you into a corner.
I wouldn't care if you are.
I know. Considering why we're here today, it seems to me one of the things that brings out the most when I'm blessed to work with 518-year-olds is that they don't know what they don't know. The tricky part, the most difficult dance step for me is sometimes I have 100 seconds to convey to them what they ought to know or need to know, or critically important things like some of what you pointed out today. If you had 100 seconds, what would you seek to make sure they're aware of?
You did paint me into a corner, but you asked me a question that is difficult, and you probably knew that, right? First of all, when I was coming up in my profession, my bosses always said, give me 5 bullet points. And I would say, I can't give you 5 bullet points. It's more than that, right? Or give me an elevator speech, 30 seconds. What's the attention span of a 17-year-old? It's not long. So I'm not sure I can help you. I think systematically, we have to associate our argument for economic benefit with the importance to our society. And that's not something you're doing, in 30 seconds walking down the hall. Across higher education. In fact, most of my work is not in rooms like this. I'm working with the American Council on Education, with ASCU, with AHI, the American Association of Hispanics and I didn't get that out, and they deserve the respect, the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Ed. Because I believe we need to challenge the way that leaders are chosen, leadership is practice and leadership development, because we are not confronting future leaders with this. Our college presidents should be seeing this. Our governors should be seeing this. I am cynical enough, not to paint you in a corner, to say there are some people who would just soon we not catch on to what's going on. Right? Because our tolerance for it is allowing it to exist. What can you do in 100 seconds with a young person? I bet you're a better expert on that than I am. I really do. I'm a damn good grandfather. But I don't do it in 100-second bites. I do it by modeling, by talking, and with 2 parents that are better at it than I am. But I am so sorry to say I don't have an answer for your question. Here's the hard part. It doesn't mean you don't have to answer it. It doesn't mean that you can get away not answering that. Anyone else want to paint me in a corner? Or, actually, if you want to paint me in a portrait, I'm cool with that. Yes?
I don't want to paint you in a corner. But I've thought a lot about your first quote, surely some revelation is at hand, and the first speaker, the opening speaker this morning's discussion around technology and how quickly things are changing, economically and globally, and what kind of a role technology plays, both in our economy, but also in our education. And I just my head goes in a little bit of a spin trying to think about the way we have education set up now and the systems that are in place, and what kind of revelation we could leverage technology for with the students that we're trying to reach and trying to work for. And I think so much about the cost of education, and if technology can play some role in reducing that cost and increasing access. And I know the institution is doing a lot in this space and experimenting in this space, and I don't see the revelation. It feels still very veiled to me, and the systems seem to stop it at every turn.
Yeah, I share some of your concern. I'm a little less distraught by it, because I think technology can play a role in educating, certainly about some things. But the experiment that I did with this MOOC on leadership for equity, diversity, and inclusion suggested that I could communicate certain ideas, values, historical, theoretical stuff, but people just need to be with one another and to talk. I don't know how a system of higher education or an institution like ours can say that one of our primary values is diversity and helping people to work and live in a world of difference, and at the same time construct the educational experience to be separate with no encounter. That I don't know it. Maybe it's a revelation that's about to come, but it hasn't come to me yet. I also want to acknowledge that the so-called substitute educational modals modal deliveries, University of Phoenix and others, are being directed towards certain segments of the American population. And those same segments, by the way, are least satisfied with their experience and running up the biggest debt. So I'm hopeful that technology is going to help us through this, but I don't know how. You're about 30 years younger than I am. I think maybe you'll see it. I won't. Really, you're 30 years younger than I am. That's why it's called a revelation. And by the way, you used the word spinning. That's why Yeats wrote, this falcon is spinning out. He can't hear the falconer. He's escaped the influence, the gravity. So I do think these are pivotal times. I do think these are difficult times. This is my whole thing, and then I'm done. I want the professionals that I influence in any way to at least occasionally take on these ideas, recognize their importance, and make a commitment to act differently. Because I will not be able to do it myself. And too many people fought too hard not to give you marginal economic opportunity where you spend the rest of your life scared, but because they thought that through their sacrifice, you and all of us could be free. I want to thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope you have a great conference.